Well, welcome. I'm Owen Thomas. I'm the managing editor at the San Francisco Business Times. I'm joined by Gary Ryan of Gilead, Shamina Singh from MasterCard, and Win Pham from San Francisco Pride. We are here to talk about employee resource groups. I was going to have a little spiel, kind of making sure everyone was up in the concept, but I think Suzanne really said it best. These are the groups within corporations that represent LGBTQ employees. It's the ones really that nonprofits like San Francisco Pride are talking to. They're the groups that, when corporate leaders need advice on issues like, Mahesh from Phil's was grappling with. They're the groups that leaders could, probably should be talking to get, to get advice, to get feedback. So we're going to have a conversation today about what LGBTQ ERGs and other ERGs are dealing with, and how their role has changed, and what the future holds for them. So if we could start, Gary and Shamina, you both are heavily involved in your company's LGBTQ ERGs, and when you often talk to ERGs all day as part of your job. But maybe we could have each of you just talk a little about what your current role or recent role, what your involvement is with ERGs, and start from there.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. So hi, everybody. I'm Shamina Singh, and I run Impact at MasterCard. So I run all the social philanthropy and also the sustainability work. And I've been the executive sponsor of our employee resource group, Pride, for 3 years. I just stepped down and turned it over to my colleague, Charmaine, who's now the executive sponsor. But we have 200 employee resource groups around the world, which represent about 10% of our employee population, so about 10,000 people. And we have about 14 Pride chapters around the world. So a significant voice and community at MasterCard in the space.
Great. Gary Ryan here. So I'm the chair for Pride Alliance, which is Gilead's employee resource group. I took over as chair just after Pride last year, so July, and previously served as vice chair, and then in various roles, which I can kind of talk about how our ERG is structured and what we do. Similar to MasterCard, we have a lot of different chapters around the world, so we have active chapters in 17 countries, I think, but with a heavy focus. We're a Bay Area company, so like most of our folks are based here. Originally from Ireland, which is the accent.
Hey everyone, again, my name is Win Pham, he, him pronouns, Director of Sponsorships here at SF Pride. Formerly, I did serve as president of the board of the organization, which put me in constant contact with many of our sponsors, and most of our sponsor contacts are the leads of the queer ERGs. Now that I am on staff and responsible for our fundraising portfolio, I help to lead the sponsorship team. I am in constant contact with people, just like Greg and Shamina, that are the ones who are the go-between between their broader corporate organization and activations to invest and show up in queer spaces such as San Francisco Pride. And what's interesting about this journey with corporate relationships with SF Pride is most of our operating budget, just about 52%, is funding from corporate sponsors. We get taken to task by our community for being seen as overly corporatized, too branded, too commoditized. And I'll get into more of that later, but I just wanted to set the table that this is an interesting conversation. I am not up here to speak about the ERG experience in the workplace, but I am here to draw the connection and connect the dots of how important it is to have queer ERGs that are supportive of organizations and movements and causes such as SF Pride. So we'll get into more of that later, and we're just so happy to be here.
Yeah, and I should say, my particular lens, at the San Francisco Business Times, we're a weekly business newspaper. We operate, obviously, digital 24/7. We have an annual event and special issue called Business of Pride. I lead that every year. I have since joining 3 years ago. And this is a very special kind of celebration where we uplift our LGBTQ business owners. We produce an annual list of the largest LGBTQ-owned businesses in the Bay Area, and we also highlight people working in the corporate world or nonprofit world. And one way that we identify these people is we go to the ERGs. We also have a list of largest employers. We go to the ERGs of those employers and say, hey, tell us about your people. What are their stories? Who's got an interesting story to tell? So, it's a rich relationship. It definitely creates, kind of a go-to for people who, basically want to connect with that community within an employee base. Again, Suzanne put it really well. This is the face and the voice of the LGBTQ community within these companies. But that voice has, I think, had a lot of people who want to silence it recently. We live in a political environment. I don't think it's lost on anyone the executive orders that issued out of the White House, really from the first day of the current administration, that said we don't want to hear from people like you. When you are the voice of queer employees, what is it like kind of functioning with that strong headwind, and maybe with a sense of caution from colleagues who are saying maybe we need to keep our heads down? Is that something you felt in recent years?
I'm happy to take that one first. Yeah, I mean, I feel a lot better now, like this year compared to last year. So this time last year, the executive orders were coming in hot. I think as a company, obviously we were talking about it a lot, and we just didn't really have a sense of, number one, how many of them actually would be upheld, because a lot of them were illegal, and then secondly, how they were going to apply them. So we talked about it a lot, and where we landed was we continued doing everything that we always had. So we still had a large participation in Pride last year. We continued with all of the programming we had historically done and brought in new programming, but just how we spoke about that externally changed. So, I think the change or the new experience for me was, just like having to deal with legal, and everything had to be legally approved, that, if there was a chance it could go external. So, and that's, that was never something we had to deal with before. So I think, like, generally, when we speak to our leadership, like, we haven't shifted from the perspective that it's still very important. As a company, our CEO and all of our leadership, the view within the company is we do better work scientifically when we have a diverse workforce and they're equipped to do their best work, and also in terms of like how we engage with communities, which is really important for us. Again, having a workforce that actually mirrors those communities is still equally important. So we've kind of kept reinforcing that message, and every time we speak to senior leadership, again as an ERG, we continuously do that. And then, reinforcing to them as well what's important for employees. We're kind of the ear on the ground, so to speak, as to we're closer to the employee experience. There obviously can be pretty detached. So I think it's just a case of constantly reminding. But fortunately, I will say we haven't changed. It was refreshing. I was at the Out and Equal conference last year in Seattle and heard a lot from companies who had really scaled back what they were doing, including pulling out of Pride parades. But yeah, we've ended up fortunately in that position where we're staying committed. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good. I mean, it's all good. I mean, as somebody who I'm also the daughter of immigrants, and so sort of being on the periphery of a lot of these conversations that have been, whether it's anti our community LGBTQ plus, but also thinking about the wars and it's just I'm constantly on guard, and it's really hard sometimes to be. To find the safe places. And so I think what we've tried to do, or what I've tried to do as the executive sponsor of Pride, is to ensure that no matter what happens in what I would say the external environment in this case, the importance of maintaining community inside the organization is really, really important, because that is a safe place. And we always want to make sure that you're able to show up and kind of do your best work. And the reason why I think these employee groups are so important is because they are our safe space. And so instead of leaning back, I was I think as a community of leaders at the organization, our responsibility is actually to lean in and listen. And that's kind of what we've been doing is with the employees, really sort of saying, okay, this is a moment to really make sure that we're understanding where our employees are in this conversation. What do we need as a community? And then how do we act as an organization? And that's the stance we took and that's why I think the employee resource groups are so incredibly important. As a matter of course, we didn't, as you said, we haven't changed, what we do, or we haven't, none of that actually has changed. But what has risen is like any time, the fear, the environment is harder. So we have to lean in to make sure that our people are more comfortable and productive and safe and all of the things that I think really matter.
Can I just add to one thing you said? So we survey our membership a lot. We constantly look for feedback on what we're doing. And the one thing that always floats to the top, and particularly the last year, is people want community. So beyond all of the the programming, the big events, the professional development that we can provide, it's always the one thing that people crave most, is to connect with other LGBT employees, to build that network themselves. And a lot of it actually ends up happening outside of the ERG, because we're just there as kind of a means for people to meet like-minded folks. But yeah, every single time that always floats to the top. So.
Right. Because it is, at the end of the day, I think for me personally, but I think the environment is you want to be seen and you want to be heard. And that's pretty basic when it comes to anything you're doing. And so this happens to be a place where its employees seem to be the connection. But at the end of the day, whether it's a customer or a voter or a citizen or an employee, it's about how are we seeing each other, how are we hearing each other, how are we supporting each other, how are we thoughtfully disagreeing with each other too. That's also really important. And I think that those are sort of values that are, they transfer. And I think that's been the way that we've approached the work. At least in this at MasterCard. But I hope, frankly, to your point that you were saying, there's so many repercussions of all of everything that happens externally. And so I think it's also an important point to say, but there are real situations that we have to, think about and act upon. And so it's also fair and fine to have that conversation as well.
And I'd love to build on that as well. Thank you, Shamina, for that. As well as Gary, you represent Gilead Sciences, which SF Pride has had a wonderful journey with this organization specifically. When we think about those individual sort of micro interactions, just like those basic needs of being seen and felt in your team, at your organization, there's a macro impact on that well. Case in point, a year ago, this time, SF Pride was struggling with sponsorship, because this was right after the January 2025 inauguration, and we all know what happened after that with the whole attack on DEI. We did have some corporate partners that shied away from wanting to continue their support publicly of this essentially DEI organization called SF Pride. Gilead stood by us. So when we talk about internal employee organizations showing that solidarity and asking for what they need and what they want, that impact translates outward. An organization, I don't want to harp on Gilead, but we're just so proud of our partnership with Gilead. And they not only refused to back down last year, but this year they increased their support of SF Pride. And we have to credit the organizing capacity and the influence and the mobilization of power that ERGs have at your organizations. It's not always top down. We don't always have to convince the leaders of these organizations that something like SF Pride is worthy of support and worthy of affirmation and continuity, it can be bottom up. And that is the value of ERGs in the workplace. When you empower your people to give themselves permission to demand what they want and what they need, people listen. And organizations tend to follow suit, and they become more consistent and more self-empowered to stand in the face of maybe national pressure to do otherwise. But we are so grateful that people like you exist, that ERGs exist, because that democratizes this power, and it shapes influence and mobilizes power on a macro level. And then you get things like the continuity of the world's most iconic Pride Parade and celebration, and platforming all those voices, making sure that our people, queer people who work at these organizations, are seen and are heard and are celebrated.
I think when the Business Times covered the struggles that San Francisco Pride was going through, one thing we did, we had a data reporter who actually enumerated who sponsored Pride year by year, and we found there were companies like Gilead that had been very consistent. Kaiser Permanente comes up as another one, and then we also kind of named we named the companies that had dropped out. Because it's the company that's missing from the list is not always very visible. We did our part as journalists to make that a little more visible. But I think it's interesting how the ERG win, if I'm hearing you correctly, is often the propelling force behind that consistency, the backbone, if you will, of the company's efforts and initiatives. Gary and Shamina, thinking about your experiences, have there been times when your ERG has been that force?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the role of, because it informs the business, right? Like, I mean, we're a bunch of employees, so of course we're going to we all sit in the business line, and so where we sit, whether it's data or transactions or whatever we're doing, we're front line on the product and services work. And so at MasterCard, one of the products that we produced that's actually live in 33 markets is the True Name Card. And that's a card that allows non-binary and trans folks to use their chosen name on their debit card or their credit card. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine how powerful that is? Like, mm-hmm. And that's because in places where you're not recognized or one isn't recognized, being able to purchase, something using the name that you identify with is really important. And I think that was something that came from listening and learning to our employees. And I think that's the kind of thing where, again, it's not necessarily about the Pride Parade, but it's about where employees at an organization are bringing themselves to the conversation in a way that lifts up the business. Like I think that's the virtuous cycle, is if you actually get to a place where the people in your organization have the agency to inform the products and services in a way that helps the business, like that's always the best area to be, because that's how you end up with something like a True Name Card or a thing that's going to recognize the needs of the community in the right way.
Yeah, I can add, we have so many examples. One that I'm really proud of, something we did a couple of years ago, we hosted a ball on campus, so which there were kind of multiple angles to why we wanted to do that. So it's very much like a aspect of LGBT culture that certainly most people within the company had absolutely no concept of. So what we ended up working with one of the choreographers from the show Pose, and they helped us find all the talent. We had a runway, so we did a whole thing on campus.
Oh, you were talking about a ballroom culture ball.
Yes, a ballroom culture
like
ball.
A real ball.
Not like a Viennese waltz style ball. But it was incredible. We weren't really sure how a lot of people would react, but it was probably we did it 2 years in a row, probably like the highest ever attended event that we held as an ERG. So it served two purposes in my mind. It just brought awareness of that whole culture to the company in general. But also, for context, most people probably know, but a lot of our core business is HIV prevention and treatment, and this is a community who are very disproportionately affected by that. So as it certainly spotlighted that community, and as a company, we've started to engage more with that community. So that was kind of a great example of I think where we, as an ERG, we very directly influenced how the company viewed an entire group of people. And then kind of more systematically, something that in fact all of our ERGs do this, but again, there are certain communities which are much more highly impacted by HIV. So Black women in the South, for example, that's not always very clearly known. People kind of just assume it's something that gay men have to deal with. So our Pride ERG, our Black ERG, our Hispanic ERG, we've been working with our marketing team on, well, how do they actually, how do you market to these people? How do you reach those communities? And it's, it's not just a video that you see when you're watching some show, which, shows a cis, male gay couple, that, there are other communities that we're trying to reach, and those materials are, more culturally sensitive to those groups. So there are lots of other examples, but I mean, there are two that I can think of where it was very much driven from the ERG, and I think very much appreciated from the business. And that, it's a cycle as well, that it kind of shows our value, which ensures, in one way of ensuring our survival as well.
Gary, the point you bring up about cultures, it's very interesting when you think about ERGs in global corporations like Gilead and MasterCard. Maybe struggling or contending, let's say, with the issue of how do we structure and run an ERG that crosses these cultural boundaries and serves a global workforce. When you're thinking about that, one example is pronouns. Some in some cultures, societies, where the language is different. I happen to speak Mandarin, and the word for he and she, it's written differently, but it's pronounced the same. These things don't always literally translate well in different environments. When you're thinking about the ERG globally, how do you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, in our case, we do give a lot of autonomy. So our ERG is mostly active in the US, Canada. We have a lot of chapters in Europe, and then our other chapters are mostly Asia and Australia, New Zealand. So I mean, we have I won't bore people with structure, but we have me as the chair. We have executive sponsors. The chapter leads report into me per se, and we have liaisons who kind of deal with a lot of the logistics. I mean, how we've managed it is we very high level align on, as an ERG, what do we want to focus on this year? And an example might be inclusive language, and that could include pronouns. But honestly, in our case, we very much leave it up to the individual chapters to decide how they're going to implement it. I mean, I'm hoping I get some ideas as to how, are there different approaches to that? But we tend to give just a lot of autonomy to our different chapters. And I mean, I will say that's mostly been relevant to Asia. I think most of our European chapters, kind of what's considered appropriate or what's feasible to roll out is pretty similar to here, because they're mostly in Western Europe. But yeah. Curious.
It's the same. They have local agency, local charters, so that they can respond to the local context in the right way. I think so. That's sort of one piece. Is in terms of the environment for where they are, they have to. They understand it better than we would at a global level. And so the idea is, how do you structure your organization? What do you focus on in the ways that matter to you? And that includes activity, right? So some might say, we want to prioritize for their budget. They might say they want to prioritize the march. Some might say, we actually want to prioritize a nonprofit program and do something else. And so it really depends on what the tone and tenor is for the organization in that particular country. I will say, though, that at the global level, I think our job, and this isn't necessarily, I think, on the ERG side of it, this is more from the corporate, like, sort of benefit side of this, which, again, the employees inform and are, definitely are involved there. But it's like, I think our job at the corporate level is to provide a level of safety, a level of security, a level of employee, protections, employee benefits, that regardless of what they decide to do in the places where choice is involved, everybody gets, access to the healthcare. Everybody gets access to the benefits globally. So I'll just bring that a little bit to life. In places, in countries that have passed made homosexuality illegal, we have a policy that says, if we don't have a large, well, even if we do, but the point is, if you don't feel safe, if you're not in a place where you can do your best work or, live the way you need to live, then the company will move you if that is what you choose to do. And so that's just one option. It may not be the best option, but it's something that we have within our control as a company to make happen with and for employees around the world.
You just remind me of something we do as well. So we have an initiative called Mission in Motion, where it's a lot of work being in an ERG, and it's generally a lot of the time it's considered an extracurricular activity. So people have day jobs, and they need to do this on top of their day jobs. One of the ways we've started to acknowledge that is people log the time they spend in the ERG, and we get to choose an organization, and then essentially those hours generate a donation that will go to an organization. The organization we chose this year was Rainbow Railroad, which just reminded me kind of what you were saying there. So they're an organization who will actually physically move people who are in dangerous circumstances. So typically in countries that have passed these kinds of laws.
Right.
So that's like it's a very small example, but I mean, I think what that kind of makes me think of is, as an ERG, you also do have the opportunity to influence nonprofits that your company might sponsor, or that you can do direct employee matching donations to as well. So I think that's something we're proud of as well, that we actually we do have an opportunity to do that, and kind of in a kind of a somewhat roundabout way, think about how we can support employees who are living in these locations as well.
Have you run into this situation where a company says, well, you have to understand we're a global company, so we're dealing with, different
Yes.
considerations?
No, it's an interesting and exciting question, because while most of our sponsorship portfolio are US-based multinational corporations, we actually do get some support from non-US-based multinational organizations. So what Gary and Shamina have shared, it's activating this idea in my head and in my experience, having supported SF Pride for so long, that we have to think globally in everything that we do. We are a very visible organization. We don't consider ourselves a local Pride organization or celebration, because we are very international. A large bulk of our attendees, both marchers and spectators, do come in from all over the world to enjoy this event and to feel seen.
Yeah.
And
this is ground zero. What do you think? I'm here. I'm
Yes.
from New York. And
Yes.
it's like, I'm in San
Yes.
Francisco because San Francisco is ground zero for everything.
Exactly. So some of the most gratifying messages and work that I get to do is interfacing with those organizations that might not have as strong of a presence stateside, but they see us from overseas and they want to be a part of us, and they march in our parade.
Right.
They will register for a group, and they will have their banner, and it is such a joyful thing to see a nation that you might not expect that would have enough of an interest, much less the resources to travel to the US right now, but they make it happen because they see SF as a world-leading city and place and character in this overall narrative that queer people deserve to be seen and are worthy of love and affirmation and joy. And that translates into, on a micro level, we're having conversations with these queer ERG leaders, both stateside and abroad, and you can kind of feel that when we have these conversations, whether it's via a Zoom or a Teams call or even an email, we're the best part of their day because they don't get to have fun, joyful, queer conversations with other queer people at their organization specifically, but they know that when they email Win or Suzanne at SF Pride or we're on a call together, that they are having the best part of their day. And when you are able to allow that spirit to pervade your workday, even for one moment of, let's say, an 8 to 12 hour workday, for one moment during that day, you get to feel seen as a queer person. You do not have to code switch. There's no pretending. There's no hiding. To your earlier point, Gary, when you feel unleashed at work, you do better work. So that is the power of the ERG activity and the ERG entity, and it extrapolates to so much more. It is far-reaching, and it's just exciting and inspiring to watch on a daily basis.
One thing that's interesting about this, this feeling of safety and openness. One thing that's come up when I've had conversations with companies about their ERGs is that they're almost always structured to be open to anyone.
Somebody.
So,
That's the-
if you're an ally, if you are someone who's trying to educate yourself, you are welcome to join. There's no kind of criterion for membership. How do you balance that openness with that feeling of safety, though? Has it ever been an issue that, kind of someone who is not LGBTQ identified wants to join, and maybe there are members of the ERG who had a different expectation, who thought oh, I thought it was going to be just us here.
Yeah. I don't think so. I mean, my experience has been anyone who actually is willing to join and do the work, they're definitely doing that with good intent. And what I find is having allies as part of our leadership team, it's been really helpful in kind of soundboarding, all right, we're thinking of doing this, like how's that going to sit with the rest of the organization? And like a great example is pronouns. So we went through this whole process of, updating Workday so we could put our pronouns in and Zoom and all the rest. And then we had this kind of case of, okay, well, now we actually need to get people to do this. So having some allies, like straight allies on our leadership team was great in terms of, coming up with messaging as to how to do that. So that's a very specific example. And actually, like, surprisingly, a lot of it was like those allies and people in general kind of just assumed that was for us, and that, oh no, well, I don't need to use pronouns because that doesn't apply to me. But the message that, well, actually you're creating a space for someone else to do that. That's the whole point. So I don't think we would have kind of gotten that if we didn't have those allies there. And I mean, just generally, again, I think people have they've always come with good intent, and quite honestly, like, we've a big contingent in Pride on Sunday. Most of our volunteers tend to be our allies, like, so the people who are checking people in the morning at our breakfast event, and the folks who are carrying around boxes of T-shirts. So I mean,
That's great.
That's been my personal experience.
You want the queer employees to have all of their energy available to
That's it. I'm like,
have someone else lift
Yeah.
the boxes.
I am just showing up on Sunday morning. Don't ask me to do anything.
Sometimes even on staff at SF Pride, obviously you must know this week especially, but this coming weekend is just so exhausting. Sometimes we joke and we're like, can we just have the allies do all the work for us?
Yeah.
And I just show up and have some champagne. That's all I want.
I think for us, you all said it, but the executive sponsor of the Pride ERG before me was an ally, a straight man, and but he also happens to be the head of technology at MasterCard, which is a really big deal. And when you're dealing with so many things at MasterCard, technology is like the hub. And now Charmaine, I intentionally worked with Charmaine because she's also in the technology space, but what it allows for is, like, very practically budget, visibility. When you want to have somebody, you want to have an advocate who is your executive sponsor who pays attention and who actually cares about this stuff. And so I think we have benefited from having a wide range of people involved in the organization.
We actually have a co-executive sponsor model. So in our case, it's our CFO who's an ally, and then we have a second exec sponsor who's a community member. And I mean, again, for the same reason, having the CFO on board helps.
Helps. It does, yeah.
And particular, in our participation in SF Pride, we also do a lot of prides globally. So I think we're doing 10 other like big activations and then kind of smaller things at a lot of others. But yeah, just again from the point of view of having him as a sounding board, because he kind of gives a whole, at a very different level, like how is this going to resonate? Like, if it's some initiative we're doing again within the organization. So yeah, he's really surprised me. I was a little bit skeptical coming in as the chair. I thought, okay, how's this going to work? But yeah, somebody at that level who's just very practical, and he's like, look, I don't know what you need, so just tell me, and he'll generally make it happen. But
Yeah.
he's been great to work with.
I think it's important also just to call in a good friend of mine. I feel like thinking about companies, and you were talking about international companies. Deutsche Bank, I think, has really they have filled the gap for many of our organizations, and so and in particular. John is the guy who's doing it. So it's like when we look back on this time, for whatever we look back on, I always say to him, I'm like, people will remember Deutsche Bank, and there are going to be certain people I think who come up, and I sort of want to just call his name into this space because I just got my invitation to go to World Pride, and they're really the ones who they're like, they've really stepped in to fill the gap, I think, globally.
Something that both Gary and Shamina said. Gary, you touched on this idea of actually at a big organization kind of being top down. If your senior leaders can demonstrate allyship, that culture does permeate, like lead by example. And then you mentioned something about leaders can also influence budget. Organizationally, we all know that a company's budget reflects its values, it reflects its priorities. One interesting thing that we at SF Pride have experienced when we are interfacing with the ERG leaders in assembling their Pride activations, their participation. ERGs technically, for most organizations, fall under HR.
Yeah.
And they draw from an HR budget, which is seen as a line item expense most of the time. It's not revenue. And every so often, we will actually get to draw from a company's marketing budget, which is seen as revenue. And when we have those marketing conversations, we can ask for bigger dollars. When we're interfacing with ERG groups, ERGs that are sort of the mercy of HR budgets, those numbers are a little bit smaller. So we feel the tension when we're having conversations with these ERG leaders who are just telling us, you know what, SF Pride, we really want to provide a much more meaningful contribution, but we are only given such amount on an annual basis, and it's renewable only annually, and if we don't use it, we lose it, and if we spend less, then we get budgeted less. We don't get a flat budget from year to year. So it's a journey that we're trying to navigate to, one, empower ERGs to ask for more budget, so that they can be a little bit freer and more liberated with the allocations that they can give to things like Pride or other events that are meaningful to the ERG. But at the same time, we're trying to tap into those marketing budgets, but it's also a tug of war because Pride doesn't want to be seen as marketing. We're a movement, and we are a mission, and we're a cause, and we are human-centered. So that those conversations are always ongoing. There's an evolution. We do see some success at the ERG level when we try to empower people like Shamina and Greg, who are leaders of your ERGs, to make those requests and to assert your ERG's right to have better support, so that you can better support your people. So it is a very interesting concept.
That's why you're so good at your job. Keep doing that, Win.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Because obviously the inside outside, it matters, right? And so when the fact that you understand that nuance so well is very helpful, because it does help. Where the money, where the line item. We're always dealing with these kinds of things on so many things, but to have a partner who kind of gets it and understands, it's much easier to have a conversation that gets us to a better place. So I love that you just sort of went through a very tedious description of how it works, but it's true.
It's true. And I guess ultimately the call to action is, one, CEOs, CFOs, please give your ERGs more money and or reclassify them so they are not simply a function of human resources, because We, as people of diversity, are worthy of more support. If you unleash us at your workplace and you make us feel supported, we will give you the best work that we can give you.
I'm gonna have to get some advice from you because outside of my, I love that. I also like outside of work, I'm on the board of the Gay Men's Chorus, and I co-chair our development committee. So that's been like a totally different experience and like a new muscle for me to develop around like fundraising from the other side. And it's kind of a similar situation where we're always trying to get companies to commit money, and it's a recent development for me. So I'm always curious to hear from others who are on that side as well as to what that's like, how it works, and so on. But so maybe that's like outside of this conversation.
We'll offline this.
discussion.
We'll put a pin in it. We'll circle back.
Yes, love the corporate speak. Yeah.
I want to make sure we have a little time for questions from the audience, but just as a last question from me for our panelists, what do you see as the future of ERGs? What will change? What needs to change in the years ahead? More money. is what I mean.
Please.
I mean, we've certainly started. So when I joined the ERG, I guess I've been involved for about 6 years in different roles. My kind of inauguration or my initial involvement, I was like, look, I'll just do whatever you want. Just tell me what you need help with. And they're like, here, can you organize San Francisco Pride? Which I did not realize what I was taking on, designing a float, all of that. But yeah, if I think of like where we've kind of come from and where we're going, so we used to be known as the Happy Hour ERG, and we still try to do some of that. We know that kind of community and connection is important for people, but we have a roadmap, and we're definitely we're on a road to evolving towards a group that's more tightly tied to like the needs of the business. So we're starting to be viewed, and I think we will be viewed more in the future as a resource that the company can pull on when they need advice in a particular issue. And so a recent example is we've been building a lot of new facilities, we've been upgrading facilities, so they've consulted with us a lot on inclusive language, on ensuring there are gender neutral spaces, all of that, which has been amazing. And I think a lot of that wouldn't have happened without a push from us. And then again, I mentioned the how do we reach communities and the marketing material. We're also starting to change our recruitment strategy around attracting diverse talent and like relying a lot more on the ERGs, whereas that all historically would have sat within like just like a central HR team. So I feel like a lot of that work is, which there are pros and cons to that, but a lot of that is kind of moving on to the ERGs. So I think generally, like we use the word business impact a lot, but I think that's where we're starting to move towards, while still maintaining a focus on community and also bringing in like the cultural awareness of aspects of our world that maybe a lot of other employees at the company are not familiar with.
Yeah, just to build on that, I mean, I just think like if the survey data that I was just looking at before, it's like 80% of potential employees look at a company based on their ERGs. And so having a Pride ERG sends a message, sends a signal, to attracting the best talent, which I think you want as a company. And so I think for the future of ERGs, I think they have long path. And the fact that 10% of our employee base is, sorry, I got that wrong earlier. It's 25% of our employee base is in an ERG now. Wow. And the latest, we're just getting our employee survey data back, and like 90% of employees say that they're proud to work at MasterCard, and I attribute that a lot to again being seen and being heard and feeling like there's belonging there, and it's a place that they can be safe, and I think that that's really, really important. So I see a long future.
And I love that last point you made when employees see this opportunity to feel unfettered and to identify with something that can provide more joy at work, then you will attract them and you will retain them. And on the flip side, if there are people that shy away from that kind of thing and they don't like organizations with ERGs that help to uplift and promote diversity and inclusion, they'll stay away and you won't have to work with them, right? You'll keep the bad ones away. And, we wish them well. Yeah. And on the broader issue and an item of just the existence of ERGs, I mentioned at the top of the program that SF Pride often comes under quite a bit of scrutiny, and we get taken to task for being overly corporate funded. And y'all, it is expensive to put on the city's largest annual free events. SF Pride is one of the few remaining global scale Pride celebrations that does not charge admission. That comes at a cost. The money has to come from somewhere. And while, yes, just over half of our operating budget does come from our corporate partners, we are all for taking corporate money and giving it to queer people, okay? That is our ethos. We just shy of saying like wealth redistribution, we're okay with being supported by these values-aligned and mission-driven brands such as Gilead, such as Lyric and the SF Human Rights Commission, BMO, Kaiser Permanente. We are very okay with having built these relationships with these true partners in community who not just throw money to get their brand splashed across our city's largest annual event, but with whom we've built relationships, and we know these people to be queer affirming and to provide equal HR benefits to their employees. We know this, and to accept money from them and ensure that queer people and allies have a place to be celebrated and to be seen and to be heard, we will never shy away from that conversation. We are trying to diversify our revenue model. We're looking to build a philanthropy program where we do get individual donations as well as maybe some foundational support. So we're a little bit less corporatized, but when it comes to these corporate partners with whom we've built these authentic relationships and who really demonstrate to their employees and their customers that queer people matter and are worthy of existence and are worthy of joy, we will always, always be a party to that and that partnership.
Good.
Yeah. One other thought, I don't know the exact numbers, but I know like a lot of what, I'm a millennial, like a slightly elder millennial, a lot of what we educate, let's say, our colleagues on, like something as, we've talked a lot about pronouns, but something as simple as that, all the people entering the workforce, so like the Gen Zers and the younger folks, like that's all just natural to them.
Yeah.
And like if they come into a workplace and they see absolutely none of this, again, it's all, a lot about the attracting good talent. You're just not going to do that. Like the newer generation have very different expectations, and I think ERGs are helping prepare companies for that newer workforce, younger workforce as well.
I think the word is employer brand management.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
very technical, very corporate. It's just another way of saying, we're cool to work for, promise.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I have heard from people, if they go to your landing page again when folks are looking for jobs, if they don't see any mention of ERGs, if they don't see that you're HRC, like Equality Index certified, all of that, good luck. You're not going to be top of their list. So.
Well, good. Well, this has been a great conversation. I hope it's been, illustrative of, how deep the involvement of ERGs goes in companies. It is, to Shamina's point, shaping product. To Gary's point, like the ERGs being consulted about new buildings and and facilities that that the company is thinking about constructing. This is real influence and real power, and I think it's important to understand how ERGs have taken that position. With that, I think I'd like to open it up to audience questions. I don't know if we have a microphone available. We've got a microphone in the back, so please, if you've got a question.
Hi, my name is Roger Dowdy, and I work with Horizons Foundation, the LGBTQ community foundation in the Bay Area, so the philanthropic questions are very near and dear to my heart. And thank you each for all of the work that you're doing and the work that you're supporting at your respective corporations, including the funds that ERGs get. And we know as well, just like WIN does, that we often hear, well, the ERG doesn't have much of a budget, which is a corporate level decision. My question is whether any of the ERGs ever are solicited for any input on the company's charitable giving overall. Because like Gilead, for example, has, enormous, and commendable charitable work, as does, your corporation, lots of other corporations as well. Are ERGs ever brought into that conversation?
I mean, I can start. In terms of like high-level strategy, I will say no. Where we haven't brought in is like, because I go to a lot of events, I go to a lot of industry events. I'm involved in like queer industry networks, etc. I do get approached by people, and I always connect those folks with the person who leads our foundation. But that's actually I hadn't thought of suggesting that. We do talk about it a little bit. So we have an inclusion council at Gilead, which is our C-suite, the ERG chairs, including myself, and then our executive sponsors. And we will generally talk about focus areas, but in terms of like kind of specific direction to the foundation, in terms of where they focus, we haven't really been involved. But yeah, that's a really interesting idea.
Well, the good news about being the executive sponsor and also leading the philanthropy for MasterCard is there's a lot of intersectionality happening at MasterCard, or at least anywhere. But I think that as a general rule, we try to I have to listen to everybody. I mean, that's part of the job. And so I will, but one thing just to, which I think is kind of interesting, could be boring for you all, but the technology that actually processes charitable contributions, it's also worth thinking about that. So we use Benevity. I don't know if any other companies use Benevity, but one of the things that came up with us is that Benevity doesn't have a platform in the Middle East. And so as we were thinking about how we're doing our contributions around, in the Middle East, or where, because our employees can contribute, they have to be able to contribute from anywhere. And the company matches up to $10,000 US dollars for any corporate, any donation from an employee. So ERGs actually become really powerful, because if you can get the Pride ERG to partner with another ERG, you're literally raising maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars for particular charities if you do it right. And so, but one thing just to always think about is, as you deal with global corporations, is the platform that does the technology of giving has to be able to process donations from anywhere to anywhere. And so that was just something that came, because I just literally was dealing with that a couple of weeks ago, was that ask those questions too when you have platforms that show up. Do those platforms allow for giving to different charities that are required? So, and do they have the levels of due diligence? It's just a whole other
It's got to be
thing.
particularly maddening for a payments company to
Exactly.
to encounter that problem.
Right.
Fun fact, SF Pride does accept donations in all currencies in the world. So check us out.
You also just reminded me, I was like, oh, I didn't give a completely correct answer there. So one of the other opportunities we have as the ERGs, we all have a Heritage Month, ours is June, and we do a Giving Together campaign where we double the matching, so we do 2-to-1 matching, and the ERG gets to choose which organization we support. So this year we chose an organization called Trans Lifeline, but we also had a lot of other organizations on our list, and some of them were not in Benevity, so not like acknowledged, or even potentially on the list for our foundation to consider. So we did actually work with the foundation to get those on, but that was more of a kind of bottom up as opposed to like us influencing their overall strategy.
Well, good. I think we are at time. Maybe we could take one more question.
First of all, thank you so much for the amazing insights. I had a quick question precisely regarding to budgeting. As ERGs, how do we demonstrate, what strategies or measures do you like to use to demonstrate impact in order to be able to go to that CFO, to that leadership team and say, look at what we're doing. It is fantastic. It has impact. Please give us money.
I don't mind answering. So I mean, we tend to I think when our senior leaders think about business impact, they're always thinking of dollars. So we try to very heavily lean in on just general employee engagement and retention. So, you know, like turnover is expensive as a company. And we have one of our corporate goals is to be a biotech employer of choice and to have a certain level of, a certain score in employee engagement. So I think you mentioned like 90%
Yeah.
for MasterCard. So we tend to like pretty heavily lean on that. And we also, when we do our annual survey, there are a lot of free text comments in there which we get access to. And a lot of them are around how the ERGs have contributed to people's sense of belonging, their desire to stay at the company. Certainly we focus on that. In our case, we have this kind of like unique situation because, again, for good or bad, HIV is very intrinsically related to the LGBT community. And for example, so we tend to get like very active on LinkedIn and social media, and we spotlight a lot of our ERG activities. So I think we try to. It's very hard to measure this, but we do use the kind of general company reputation angle. That content is used in promotional materials. But I'm curious to hear, like, I can't think of any examples where we've had like a very, putting a direct dollar number on something is easy. That's a really tricky thing to do.
It's a good prompt, because I think it always helps when you can provide a metric, whether it's an impact amount or lives changed or jobs created and things like that. And as somebody, again, in the philanthropy space, that's like half the battle for me, is trying to articulate the impact of what we're doing. And so I was just looking, because I was trying to see if I had the numbers from our impact report is about to come out, where we've put survey results in there and things like that. But putting it to a dollar amount hasn't been something that we've managed to do in that sense. But I think proxies for impact include things like, are you proud to work here? Are you planning to leave? And if so, why? And if, where would you go? And what matters to you? And those are the types of things I think we measure.
I'm going to give you all a phrase you can steal: return on inclusion.
ROI, there you go.
Hi.
That's what we need to work on. So that's what's next. We're going to figure this out, how to measure that and prove the value.
And Owen, I so love that. On an SF Pride sponsorship basis, each of our sponsor relationships, we also issue an impact report post-event. And while it's not as qualitative as we might like how are the people who are marching the parade, how do they feel after versus how they felt before? What we can measure are things like reach. ABC7 is our main media sponsor. We are the most watched Pride event in the nation during Pride weekend. And so we have numbers like that. We can demonstrate and deliver metrics such as how many eyeballs did Gilead get over the course of the weekend, and how many people walked by all these logos. So in terms of that kind of return on inclusion, there are ways that SF Pride takes great care to measure so that we can provide that argument that the more that you spend with us and support with us, the more we'll be able to activate spaces and have more touch points where the people who are attending our event can interface with your brand. So to your question, that is the information that we then feed back to our contacts, mostly ERG leads at these sponsor organizations. And the hope is always that they will run that up the chain and plead that case that this is an event that is worthy of support. But again, those decisions get made at the top, and sometimes priorities shift for whatever reason. Your budget, again, does reflect your organization's values and priorities. And the hope is, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? So our other call to action, our plea is, if you are a lead of an ERG, and we do equip you with this hard data, that you do share it onward with leadership so that you can effect meaningful change at your organization and further uplift the queer people whom you work alongside and for.
Well, good. Well, I think we are at time. Thank you all for joining us for this great discussion. Gary, Shamina, Wynn, thank you all.
for facilitating. Thank you.
And thank you,
And,
Owen, for hosting.
Yes.
Oh, my pleasure.